Hello and welcome. My name is Joe Caramelli, and I oversee grand rounds for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And thank you for joining today's presentation. I wanted to mention a couple of things about the grand round series. We've got a core team of people that work on grand rounds each week, which includes Samhara Braha, who does coordination and communication, and Mike Walker on technology. We record and archive all of the grand rounds presentations on the department website, and you can see all the past presentations from this grand round series. We do have funding for the grand round series from the Ripley Fund and from the Garvey Institute for Brain Health Solutions that I want to acknowledge. Close towards the end of the presentation, I'll put up a link in the chat. That's a 5-question grand rounds presentation evaluation. If you get a moment, it's fairly quick. Please complete the evaluation. That's helpful for me with planning grand rounds and with communicating with the presenter. You can submit questions in the chat or in the Q&A during this presentation, and I'll go through those at the end of the presentation. So now for today's presenter. Today, our presentation grand rounds presenter is Dr. David Kopat, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at UW. Now, Dr. Kopat completed medical school and psychiatry residency at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and then stayed on as a faculty member. Later, interestingly, Dr. Kopat practiced in New Zealand for several years before joining the medical staff at the Puget Sound VA in 2013. And since then, during that time, Dr. Kopat has worked in the primary care mental health integration clinical service and has participated really widely in psychiatry resident education with clinical supervision each year, lectures, and committee work. And during this time of clinical work in primary care, Dr. Kopat has maintained and developed interests and expertise in whole health topics, and is now, in addition to psychiatry and neurology, so board certified by the American Board of Integrative Medicine. And Dr. Kopat has had work which has included a national position over the last 5 years as the whole health education champion through the National VA Office of Patient-Centered Care and Cultural Transformation. He's the author of 2 books in this area. One is called Rehumanizing Medicine, a holistic framework for transforming yourself, your practice, and the culture of medicine. And a second book called Walking the Medicine Wheel, which healing trauma and PTSD. I'll stop there for now and turn it over to Dr. Kopat.
Thanks, Joseph. Can you see the slides there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for joining today. It's kind of a weird thing to do virtual presentations. We're getting used to it now, but to talk about something kind of personal like the soul, and it's very disembodied. So I'm talking here and I can't see anybody. So, but that's the way it is these days with the pandemic. Disclosure first. This is the talk is on the occasion of my application for promotion from assistant to associate professor in the teacher clinician track. I'll be reviewing my academic and scholarly work, and some of this work is in the form of book publications, which I potentially can get royalties from. However, I'm not presenting to promote the books. I'm happy to provide a PDF of any relevant chapters or material covered in this presentation for scholarly use. So we can just speak about some of these ideas. And our learning objectives. So I hope by the end of the presentation, you can identify and review the history of the soul as an explanatory metaphor in psychiatry for self-knowledge, clinician wellness, integrative and holistic medicine, cross-cultural work, human rights, and the medical humanities. I also hope that you can distinguish between different conceptual frameworks, such as the tension between the art and science of medicine, or the difference between a technician and a healer, or protocol manager and professional. We'll also speak about Darwin's terms, lumper and splitter. So the lumper being kind of a holistic approach in perspectives of working with data, and the splitter being more of a reductionist approach. And lastly, I hope that you can take some initial steps towards creating a personal counter curriculum of a continuing human education program to work with burnout to better care for yourself and for your patients. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by counter curriculum and continuing human education. So thank you all for joining, and let's go ahead and get started. So we'll ask some questions first. Is there something essential about being human which cannot be measured, quantified, or protocolized? And is this involved in health and healing as well? If there is something like that, what is it? What do we call it? Is it relevant to psychiatry? And you might guess from the title of the talk, we're going to speak about the soul as possibly this essential thing about being human. And I think often of this quote by Cameron, sociologist. He wrote that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So our paradigm is very much a counting paradigm of evidence-based approaches to working with people. And yet, what if there's something that doesn't fit well into an evidence-based scientific approach to working with people, to working with mental disorders, and to promoting health? So psychiatry, what is it? We're being trained in it, we're working in psychiatry. Originally, the etymology of the word meant literally a healing of the soul. Somewhere along the line, we've turned it into a science of the mind, and largely psychiatry is the diagnosing of mental disorders and treating them using psychopharmacological approaches. But are we missing something in psychiatry, something of our history? Have we kind of edited out the soul from our work? And is there some benefit of trying to reanimate? The word animate versus inanimate refers to anima and animus, the soul. So could we reanimate psychiatry in some way to include the soul back into our conceptual framework of who we are as psychiatrists and how we work with people? So we can ask, what is the soul? I'm saying, for the purpose of this presentation, it's an explanatory metaphor. We're not getting into metaphysics or religious distinctions about the soul or whether it persists after the body, but more, what does it mean to be fully human? What is our highest humanity? Where does our sense of right and wrong and good and bad and our sense of morality come from? And if there is such a thing as a soul, can it be lost? And how can it be found again? So let's pick up our story here with this young man. This is a picture of myself, 1986. So I think I would have been about 18 years old, freshman year of college. And I had just gone through a dark night of the soul. I'd gone to college thinking, I'll be an astronomical aeronautical engineer and design spacecraft for NASA. And that sounded really fun and exciting and important. And yet I was not very well prepared in math. Our high school didn't have an advanced topics math. We had science and English, and I did well in those, but math was always my weakest subject. So I failed a third of my credit hours, a 5-hour class, my first semester at college. And I didn't know what I was going to do. My mom had dropped out of college after a couple of years. My dad never went to college, but he taught college classes as a pilot. And so I felt this pressure, kind of this family pressure. Am I going to disappoint people? And more just, what am I going to do with my life? And so it was winter, and I was staring at my bookshelf here, you can see in the back, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was just sort of staring through everything. And all of a sudden my eyes kind of came into focus, and I thought, I wonder if by looking at the books that I'm interested in, I can determine what it is that really matters to me, what stirs my soul. And so I picked up this book off the shelf, A Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung. And I thought, I always like this book. It covers a lot of really interesting topics. Flipped it over and saw, he was a psychiatrist. And I thought, wow, psychiatrists can study all these different things. Whatever's human, a psychiatrist can study. That was back in the old days. He wrote this book in 1930s, 33, I think. So I thought, well, how do I become a psychiatrist? And so the rest is kind of history. I got to this point because of this book and because of Carl Jung's book on Modern Man in Search of Soul. And because of it also helped me come through this dark night of the soul, a personal dark night of the soul myself. Okay, so so here's the contents of the book. Some of the main themes in this book, that stood out to me. Psychotherapy is a lifelong self-perfecting of the doctor. Jung talks about the human quality of the doctor and how we maintain and develop that human quality. It's cross-cultural and interdisciplinary. He draws from anthropology, archaeology, religious studies, philosophy, ancient history. He looks at medical humanities, psychology and literature, and art was very important for him as well. The role of spirituality in healing. In psychological theory of types, he talks about the process of individuation, the importance of how we're meant to grow and work to become more whole all through our lives. And he developed the concept of introversion and extroversion. I was a very introverted, shy person. And when I read this, I was like, oh, there's not something wrong with me. I'm just attuned inwardly. I'm an introvert versus an extrovert. And when I tried to decide, what do I want to do in my life? I love reading books. I'd love to be a philosophy professor, maybe a religious studies professor. But what would be more extroverted? What would be the more difficult road, the road less traveled? And so I thought, yeah, I'll go ahead and be a psychiatrist, even though I'm a little uncomfortable about having to work so much with people instead of books. And so this concept of individuation has also been one that's been personally meaningful to me and has helped me often choose, the road less traveled, the more difficult path, because I know that that's where I'm going to grow. And lastly, he talked about developmental crises. He sort of laid the foundations for the idea of the midlife crisis, although he didn't use that term. And he talked about neurosis as a creative conflict, a creative opportunity. So in contradistinction to Freud, who saw the unconscious as, the repressed instincts that had to be managed and in a way worked with, Jung thought that the conflict was the unconscious is trying to grow and the ego is trying to stay the same. The ego is trying to limit itself. The unconscious actually wants to grow through the ego. And so making the unconscious conscious is the way that the ego expands itself. So many of these ideas were quite influential to me. And let's kind of see where we're going from here. Let's look at moving from Jung's book, a modern man in search of the soul, to modern psychiatry. I also think this idea of modern is interesting to read 1933 and Jung talking about moderns. It gives me kind of a sense of humility. We don't often have a sense of history in psychiatry. We're always so focused on the cutting edge and the latest evidence and the latest literature, and we lose something of the roots of our discipline. And so what's modern today is not modern tomorrow. It's not modern 5 years from now. So this whole idea of modern, in some ways, I often think of it as a being in quotes. But let's look at, modern psychiatry and what are some different themes for this presentation where we can explore how we could look at soul and maybe regain the soul in ourselves and in our discipline. So we'll look at Jungian perspectives, whole health kind of coming out of the VA, and holistic and integrative health and medicine, clinician wellness, cross-cultural and indigenous perspectives, humanism and medical humanities. And we're just going to touch on human rights, medicine, social justice, and medical activism. I actually did a whole grand rounds on that for University of Washington over in Idaho. So if anyone's interested in that, we're just going to really comment on it and move on because there's so much material today, but it could be a whole other topic. So Jungian perspectives. Let's start here. This is where I started coming into psychiatry, and we'll start this talk with it as well. So Jung's writing about psychotherapy here, and he says, we've learned to place in the foreground the personality of the doctor as a curative or harmful factor, and we've begun to demand the doctor's own transformation, the self-education of the educator. The self-criticism and self-examination demanded of the doctor radically alter our view of the human psyche. This cannot be grasped from the standpoint of natural science. It's not only the sufferer, but the physician as well. Not only the object, but the subject. Not only a function of the brain, but the sine qua non of consciousness itself. What was formerly a method of medical treatment now becomes a method of self-education, and therewith the horizon of our modern psychology is immeasurably widened. The medical diploma is no longer the crucial thing, but the human quality instead. And so a couple things I want to touch on here, this idea of the human quality. In our research, comparative psychotherapy research, we find that common factors or common variables are often what's most important in the outcome of psychotherapy. So it's not necessarily the modality or which evidence-based practice we're using, but something about the person of the psychotherapist and the relationship that they're able to create with empathy and compassion. There's a recent book, Compassionomics, by Charjak and Mazzarelli, and they review the literature on compassion, and they conclude compassion is an evidence-based intervention in and of itself. It works, helps for burnout in staff, and it also helps with patient contact, patient rapport, and patient outcomes. So we really should consider compassion as an evidence-based practice. And that comes out of that human quality. But how much do we teach the human quality? We have continuing medical education, but do we also not need continuing human education? If we know that this impacts variables or impacts outcome in psychotherapy, and as well with prescribing medications, we know the influence of the therapeutic relationship also impacts the outcome with psychopharmacological treatment. Should we not be having some type of ongoing continuing human education for ourselves, not just to be good technicians and scientists, but to be good, well-rounded, individuated humans, as Jung might say. So Jung, you wrote about the soul pretty often. Seele is in German, would be pronounced something like that. So Jung wrote that humanity as a whole has held this belief in the soul from its earliest beginnings. And it was left for the second half of the 19th century to develop a psychology without a soul. And now we largely have a psychiatry without a soul as well. I mentioned how prevalent our reduction to how can we take the whole of the person, turn it into a set of variables that we measure on a scale, and then how can we diagnose a mental disorder, and then how can we make those numbers move in the way we want them to move. And so we also have a psychiatry that's largely without a soul, just as in the 1930s, Jung was saying already psychology was losing its soul. So Jung wrote this book called The Red Book. It wasn't published until well after his death. It was published, I think, in around 2009. He died in 1961. So he wrote this book between 1913 and 1917, roughly. It was after his break with Freud. Freud had been grooming Jung to be, quote, crown prince of psychoanalysis. And Freud really had this kind of dogma. He wanted people to, he really wanted an heir to hand psychoanalysis over to, and yet people always disappointed him because they were having their own ideas, their own thoughts. And so Jung kind of got excommunicated from that circle, and the same thing happened with like Adler and Otto Rank and a number of different people, you know, who were in the in crowd in psychoanalysis and then were on the outs. So Jung lost his companions, his friends around 1912 when he wrote his book called Symbols of Transformation, volume 5 in his collected works, which is a book about the hero myth. And also the idea that the unconscious has a spiritual component that's trying to encourage growth. It's not just instincts that's trying to bring us down into the animal level, but there's also something in the unconscious that's trying to strengthen us or expand us into the human, and maybe even, you know, growing beyond our human limitations. So Jung, in this book, he wrote out, it's a huge book too. I don't know how big the picture you can see me is, but you know, it's this really kind of massive tome that has all these paintings, and it's basically an illuminated manuscript, but you can also get it in the reader's version, which is you know, more of a manageable version, but there's no artwork in it. So these pictures here are art pieces that Jung had painted from his dreams and his imaginings, what he called active imagination. So he starts this book, going through his own dark night of the soul of this break with Freud and trying to figure out, well, what's he going to do? His idea of where he was heading no longer works for him. And he starts the book saying, I had become aware that I had lost my soul. My soul, where are you? Do you hear me call you? Are you there? I've returned after long years of long wandering. I have come to you again. I thought and spoke much of the soul. I knew many learned words for her. I had judged her and turned her into a scientific object. The soul is everywhere that scholarly knowledge is not. So Jung starts to, have this kind of dichotomy of that we can pursue things through science, which are really helpful, but we may lose our own souls in doing that. And that our scholarly knowledge is important and useful in certain ways, but it also neglects or abandons a certain part of ourself. And so Jung, you can see how he might be considered the precursor of art therapy, how he used his own artwork as ways of working out his relationship between the consciousness and the unconscious. And also he encouraged people, his patients as well as colleagues, to create their own red book, to create their own book of the soul that was filled with dreams and imaginings and visions and ways of trying to bring the unconscious through artwork into consciousness so that the ego and unconscious could interact with each other. And Jung, so as he said there, 1913, of how he lost his own soul, he sometimes would comment on this, throughout his life, that we can lose our soul. So when we suffer from a lack of psychic energy, we say we have a depression or an inhibition, not realizing that part of our mental hierarchy has gone away beyond our control, that we have in fact lost our soul. And even more than soul, he talked about self. And so the self was the goal of individuation, of becoming whole. Sometimes in Jungian literature, this is capitalized, although he didn't capitalize the self, he used a small s. So in describing it, he says the self is a term on the one hand definite enough to convey the essence of human wholeness, and on the other hand, indefinite enough to express the indescribable and indeterminable nature of this wholeness. So in science, we want precision. We want our words very well defined. We want them to mean this and not that. And yet Jung is saying here with the self, and I would say also somewhat for the soul, that that type of language, that's what he's saying, where the science and the scholarly knowledge sort of banish the soul. The soul needs kind of more vague, fuzzy, inclusive, holistic types of approaches rather than very reductionistic, logical, linear, definite approaches. So the way that Jung approached the self is very much how we could also say we should approach the soul. Here's just a few books, of the influence of Jung and writers on the soul. Most of these are Jungians, post-Jungians writing. On the left, we have looking at trauma and the soul, which is a very easy pairing because, people come back from war and their body's there, but they feel like they're not there, like they lost something of themselves. So, as Ed Tick wrote about restoring the soul after war, how do we help a person come back, not just in body, but in heart and soul as well? And on the right, we see some books on nature and the soul. So Jung talked about the anima, sort of the soul of the human, but also the anima mundi. An old, I believe that's Latin term for the soul of the world and how these are interconnected. And when we work on one, when one's out of balance, the other's out of balance. And so to change things in the environment, we need to change things in ourselves as well as the environment. And look how those two levels of soul work together. So let's talk a little bit about whole health and holistic and integrative medicine and how the soul is important here. The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Yet when we think about what we do on a daily basis, how much are we promoting health? How much are we working for physical, mental, and social well-being versus how much are we trying to hunt out, diagnose, and treat disease? So this makes us pause and think, is there something more we could be doing for health? Well, this is what the task we kind of put on ourselves in VA with Whole Health. So this is a national VA initiative. It comes out of the Office of Patient-Centered Care and Cultural Transformation. I work as about 1 day a week as a national education champion, teaching VA staff about whole health in courses and also developing curricula. So for instance, I developed a module on burnout, resilience, and moral injury for our whole health for mental well-being course. So something that's interesting with a health-oriented focus versus a disease-oriented focus. With disease, you know, for diabetes, we've got a treatment for diabetes. We don't give it to somebody who doesn't have diabetes. Or we have a treatment for schizophrenia. We don't give it to somebody who doesn't have schizophrenia. But within a health-based approach, it works for everybody. Anybody who's human, you know, can benefit from a health-based approach. So we teach this for staff, VA staff, how to care for themselves. And we teach it for VA staff for different ways of caring for veterans and promoting self-care for veterans. So I really like to look at the circle of health as describing what is whole health. It's a holistic, multidisciplinary approach to what it means to be a human being and what are the different domains that are important for health. So we start in the center with me and we. This is my kind of adaptation. I add the we because we're, you know, we should know by now with the pandemic, we're kind of all in this together. So I put me and we there at the center. Through mindful awareness, which is really just paying attention or being present with ourselves, we connect to, starting at 12 o'clock, our body. We have physical bodies, we need to take care of them. Our bodies are in physical and emotional surroundings. Those can impact our health positively and negatively. Continuing around at 3 o'clock, we've got personal development. We grow throughout our lives, just how Jung had this idea of individuation, that we're always growing. So too, we've got formal and informal education. We've got hobbies. We've got interests that we develop. And those are important for our health. We have to nourish ourselves. We put different things in our body that can be healthy or unhealthy. Not only does our body have to move, it also has to rest. So we need to develop ways that we care for our body in rest as well as in movement. We know relationships affect health on many different levels, positively and negatively. So we need to attend to our relationships. Also too, you'll notice here I circled spirit and soul. When I talk to veterans, I say, this isn't about religion. It could be, you know, religion could be where you attend to your spirit and soul. But what we're talking about here is, where do you feel alive? How do you feel connected to something larger than yourself? Is it out in nature, you know, sitting by the ocean? Is it playing with a puppy or a cat or your kids or your grandkids? Is it volunteering? Is it helping somebody else? How do you feel some sense of connection beyond the limitations of your body? That's kind of how I define it when I'm talking with veterans or staff when we're teaching it. And I would say, so not only are we encouraged to attend to soul in the VA through whole health, really it's kind of a mandate. We're supposed to do this. This is part of the work at the VA nationally. It's not just a program here that I made up. It's a national thing that's going on. And we look at the power of the mind, how the mind can either have a negative influence, our thoughts, we can have cognitive distortions and we can have a negative influence, or we can think in ways that affect our health positively, or we can develop gratitude practices or compassion practices using our thoughts in a different way. So I just want to say too that this is a national movement. There were 18 flagships picked out throughout the whole United States that got $3 to $5 million each to develop whole health there. There's 36 kind of level 2 sites. Puget Sound is a level 2 site. Portland is our flagship for our vision. And so something I worked on last year too to show the size of this movement is we did a Transforming Healthcare conference that reached 3,000 VA staff across the country. It was called Transforming Healthcare, Integrating Whole Health into Mental Health and Primary Care. So it's a really big movement that's going on at VA. So let's, oh, here's Darwin. Let me take a sip here and pause. So Darwin talked about biologists who would see differences, what he called splitters, and biologists who would see similarities, what he called lumpers. And I think about these two ways of seeing and how they might be kind of paradigms for our reductionistic approach to, carving things into smaller and smaller units and working with them, and a holistic approach of trying to look at larger and larger synergistic interactions. And we'll see a few different variations of this as we go along. So clinician wellness. Oh, and I'll mention one other thing too. Louis Melmadrona, who's written a lot about indigenous health and narrative medicine. He talks about two-eyed seeing. So that's another way of looking at this, is we need to develop two-eyed seeing. We need to develop an eye to be reductionistic, but we also need this eye of holistic, an eye to see the whole person, or maybe to see the soul even of the person, as well as to see the smallest biology or biochemistry we can break down. So clinician wellness. I'm going to read a poem, not because I'm a great poet. I've published a couple things, but I just thought this might kind of capture the essence of what it is to lose something. So I'll just read this, and then we can talk a little bit here. It's internship years when I wrote this poem, and I can't write any poetry in internship year. Just I don't have the feeling, I don't have the flow. So I wasn't writing any poetry, but I had a dream that I wrote some poetry at the bottom of a progress note. This is before the electronic medical record. So I wrote on the bottom of a progress note, and I painted a light gray border around it. And then I had to tear it off because you can't write poetry in a patient's chart. And then I had a dream a patient was trying to kill me. I beat his head against the ground, and I ran away, and I woke up and I had a nervous tick in my left eye for 1 week, even when I didn't drink too much coffee. I can't write poetry this year. Maybe if I could write, I wouldn't have gotten that tick, and I wouldn't have had those dreams. So again, not necessarily great poetry, but it captures something important. And it's interesting, kind of ironic to write a poem about not being able to write poetry, but my inability to write poetry came out in my dream, where I was trying to write poetry and then realizing there's no room for poetry even in my dreams. And I remember another thing from internship year. There was a guy I saw in the, called the West Side VA at that time. It's on Damon Avenue in Chicago, and now it's Jesse Brown VA. I saw this guy, a Vietnam vet, and he was telling me just about what's been going on in his life. And he's just talking normally, telling me this story, but the whole time there's tears like just streaming down out of his eyes. But there was the disconnect between his emotions and what he was saying. And he told me he's a Vietnam vet and how his best buddy from Vietnam had just killed himself recently. And then he said after that, his brother and his sister-in-law had been killed in a break-in in New York City. And he's telling me all this, and the tears are flowing, and I'm like, this is just not normal. And so internship year, you all remember that, maybe you're in it now. It can be a tough time. And so I looked forward to Christmas, and I went home for Christmas, and I was like, oh, a whole week off. This is going to be great. I'm going to get so relaxed. I'll feel so much better. And I went home, I couldn't sleep. I kept waking up early. One morning I woke up and I was eating cereal, and I realized I wasn't having any emotion, but I was having the same tears like flowing down my face. And I was like, this is just not normal. What's going on with me? But I've lost some connection with emotion and between emotions and myself. And so looking back, we could kind of say, is this burnout? Is this soul loss? What is this sort of disconnection? In a book, we'll talk about my co-author Joseph Rael in a little bit, but one of our books came out in 2020 called Becoming Medicine. I was looking back at Rehumanizing Medicine, book that I wrote before coming to the VA. And in Rehumanizing Medicine, I'd written about the need for a counter curriculum of inner learning to counterbalance the scientific and technical curriculum of medicine. I also called for a compassion revolution to bring heart back into medicine. I felt like I was losing my soul in my medical training and studying the reductionist curriculum of medicine, and the counter curriculum was a kind of soul retrieval for me. So, what do I mean by this idea of a counter curriculum? I would carry around a novel. I was reading Dostoevsky a lot. I would carry around a meditation book or a poetry book. I'd make sure that the last thing in my head before I went to sleep wasn't the Krebs cycle, but was something human, something that made me think of something inspiring. my friend Darren and I, we would skip class sometimes, and we'd take our backpacks filled with our old, tomes of anatomy and physiology and everything. We'd go down to the Art Institute in Chicago on free day. And we'd sit in a cafe and drink, free refill coffees. And I'd listen to these artists who would talk, would sit there, these kind of regulars. And this old guy named Joseph, a Polish guy, who'd speak with his accent and talked about how human beings are made of light. And he talked about beauty and truth and the soul. And I would just sit there studying, and I would be listening to him in the background. I just get this smile on my face sometimes listening to him. And then, Darren, my friend, and I, we put our books, we push them into these lockers. You put a quarter into, push them into these lockers, and then we'd go around and look at art. And it felt like it rebalanced me somehow. I felt like I had to fight for something of who I was. Against this onslaught of a reductionistic scientific curriculum and just this mass of information. I just felt I was getting lost in a mass of information. So I wrote this book, Rehumanizing Medicine, and some of these themes that I spoke about, dehumanization versus rehumanization. How can we reconnect to that human, or I didn't talk about it that much in this book, but how could we reconnect to our souls? Talked about the compassion revolution and the counter curriculum. I came to this idea of that being a healer and being a technician were kind of two different things. We were being taught to be technicians, but not really how to be healers. And I didn't talk about this in this book, but later I've developed it kind of from the ideas in this book of continuing human education. I mentioned that earlier. So here's a quote, future doctors are attracted to medicine for idealistic and humanitarian reasons, but through training, they often lose this idealism. How can we preserve idealism and humanitarianism in medicine? And practicing physicians have high rates of burnout, job dissatisfaction. How can we reinvigorate the practice of medicine and make it sustainable? And again, I don't want you all to go out and buy these books. I'm happy to give you PDFs of anything if you're interested in quotes or chapters. So here's, I kind of graphed it out. What's the difference between a technician and a healer? And can we be both? Do we have to choose between one or the other? Technician is standardized, healer's individualized. The technician's reductionistic, the healer thinks holistically. Technician thinks in evidence-based medicine approaches, the healer's thinking about human-based medicine. The technician's disease-focused, a healer's health-focused, like, consistent with the WHO's constitution. Technician is a protocol manager. The healer's a connection manager. The technician prioritizes the computer, as a glorified data entry clerk sometimes. The healer prioritizes the human. A technician repeats a procedure without variation, and a healer varies a procedure to fit the individual. The technician has a narrow scope, limited to technique. The healer has a broader scope as a professional. And this is also when I think about medical activism or human rights medicine, for us to think beyond the person in front of us and beyond the four clinic walls to looking at the health of the community or the health of the country, of the world. And is that part of our identity as a physician, or really are we just somebody who prescribes medications to people who've been identified as having depression? The technician focuses on biology, and the healer, could we say they focus on the soul? So if we think about this, what is it that burns out? We talk about that burnout. There's high rates, over half of physicians are burned out by many different studies and measures. So what is it that burns out? I've come to think, maybe it is the soul. Maybe that's what burns out, this thing that's intangible that we lose somehow. Christina Maslach, one of the primary researchers on burnout who developed the Maslach burnout inventory, has a quote that kind of speaks of this. Burnout is the dislocation between what people are and what they have to do. It represents an erosion in values, dignity, spirit, and will, an erosion of the human soul. I see there's something in the chat. I'll come back to the chat a little bit later at the end here.
David, that's just me adding in some comments.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so what is burnout? The Maslach burnout inventory looks at exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. I've come to think of existential exhaustion. There's some days I'm just like, you know what? I'm just tired as a person. Like my personhood is tired after going through this pandemic and, you know, the events in the country, the events in the world, the, you know, social justice issues, the war, the division between people. I'm just like, I'm just exhausted. You know, I've lost my vitality. There's distancing techniques to help us manage overwhelming emotions. We depersonalize, or we become cynical or negative. This is the second part of the burnout triad. And then we have reduced efficacy. We're going through the motions, but there's something that's just not present there. You know, we're just doing the minimum kind of to get by. So I'm giving a talk at Seattle University, a keynote on the 25th, 26th of June on deeper dive into this idea of burnout as a soul loss and how we can recover the soul. And there's CEUs. We don't have continuing human education units yet, but hopefully in the future we can. So here's the latest kind of workbook I've been doing. This is an adaptation of rehumanizing medicine to think of how we can apply this. On the right, we have kind of my, you know, there's that circle of whole health the VA uses. This is what I created before coming to VA, was this kind of mind or body, emotion, mind, heart, creativity, intuition, spirit, physical and environmental context, and then time or temporal beings. And in thinking about soul, I think of it as like what animates. And again, you know, soul is at the root of etymology of animate. What animates each of these different dimensions, but also what connects them. There's this interesting term called anticolouthia, which comes from the Stoic philosophers that says every virtue requires the other virtues to complete it. And it's this great holistic kind of synergistic concept that we don't really have in most of our medicine and our evidence and science, where we think, no, we want the variables not to be interconnected. But anticolouthia, the Stoic philosophers, were saying we can't separate out what it is to be human and just talk about the body, or just talk about the mind or the heart. You know, to talk about the human, we need all these virtues or all these dimensions interlocking together. So it's a holistic approach rather than reductionistic approach. And some of these things on the left, then I've thought about, well, maybe this is how we could implement working with burnout and recovering soul. There's an evidence base for, you know, many of these things, like, you know, narrative writing, journaling, you know, movement, mindfulness approaches for working with burnout, using creativity. There's ways that things have been studied with medical students of exposure to art and literature and how that increases compassion. But two things that I think about here that are sort of two sides of the same coin. We can't get away from pain and suffering. You know, that's why we're here in the work that we do. And yet, if we don't have joy and bliss in what we do, the pain and suffering overwhelms us. We get vicarious traumatization, secondary traumatization. You know, the first study I worked on was looking at PTSD symptoms in relationship to internship year with Deb Clayman and Linda Grossman at University of Illinois, Chicago. So I knew from right at the beginning, the work that we do can be traumatizing. So we need some way to metabolize the pain and suffering, and we need a way to nurture and cultivate joy and bliss. Okay, so I want to be selective in what we're going to talk about here. So I want to make sure we have some time for some comments. Okay, so let me go through a couple slides here. I think I'm going to skip this one other than to mention Eduardo Duran talks about healing the soul wound. He draws on Jungian approaches and talks about this human quality that we need to focus on developing ourselves as healers before we can give to others. He also makes an interesting point that this doesn't belong to one group. Ideas about healing belong to all of us. He says that indigenous people have existed throughout the world, and everyone on the planet is part of an original people. There's only one origin of all people. So he's really trying to say, you know, this isn't cultural appropriation. Anyone working with indigenous people should think this way, and you've got a responsibility to work on yourself so that you can work with indigenous people, and that actually we're all kind of indigenous people in some ways. Vine Deloria Jr., he wrote also valued Jung's approach and talked about Jung and the Sioux traditions. He criticized Jung as writing, in the 1930s about primitives, but he said that Jung, the way Jung talked about dreams, vision, and nature, shared something with indigenous approaches to reality, and that Jung had this kind of two-eyed way of seeing. He could see as a scientist and a Westerner, but he could also understand kind of the language of dreams and vision and the natural world the way that indigenous people looked at it. So here's my friend and co-author, Joseph Rael, Beautiful Painted Arrow. So he's enrolled in Southern Ute tribe. He grew up at Pickery's Pueblo with his father's people. He's got a bachelor's in Spanish from the University of New Mexico, a master's in political science from the University of Wisconsin. He's been recognized by the United Nations for his work on world peace. From a foundational vision, he saw a sound peace chamber of a circular chamber with men and women chanting for world peace, and he's helped to develop over 60 of these across the globe. And that's why the UN recognized him. He's the author of 11 books, and his last three books we've written together. So we've collaborated. We usually talk a couple times a week. Before the pandemic, I'd go down and visit him once or twice a year and send things back and forth through the mail. We've written 3 books, a number of articles, a chapter in an edited book coming out. So here's what Joseph says about, in his Tiwa name, Shu Takoe, his Beautiful Painted Arrow. So here's what he says about the soul. The soul, in metaphor, is the process of drinking light. When the soul does not drink light, it begins to dry up. Loneliness and separation are the results of the soul's lack of nurturing. So there must be a continuous process to connect the soul with this flow of love, with a flow of light or love, out of which comes genuine fulfillment. All it must do then is stay in touch with light-filled creativity. So we can see, kind of the idea of burnout, this kind of loneliness, separation, drying up, but somehow we need to remain in touch with this light that we can drink. And this reminds me of the Polish artist, Joseph, who I used to hear at the Art Institute talking about how we are light. How could we be anything else? And here Joseph Rael is saying we need to drink light. If we don't drink light through the soul, through bringing in visions, through creativity, then, we'll dry up. And I am going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a few slides, so bear with me here. Arthur Kleinman's written about the soul. I'm happy to share my slides if anyone wants to see those. And let's go here, another Joseph Rael quote again. So he says, here we're talking about medical humanities. You see, my art is mostly about medicine and the work I've done. Art medicine is what heals people's souls. It heals the split that happens in people and brings people together. Art is medicine for human beings. And Joseph's an artist as well. We feature his art in the books. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to a close here. Maybe we wouldn't have time for the human rights medicine, but I'll mention the Doctor's Humanist. I belong to this international organization of looking at how we can bring heart and soul back into medicine. We put on free virtual conferences. We did one recently on nature and medicine. I'm actually the chair of the subcommittee on nature and medicine. So we're doing something yearly to look at how we can use the medical humanities to address environmental issues. And I'm going to skip ahead here. So how could we, this is kind of esoteric. How could we work with ourselves? Let's start with ourselves, but you can work with the patient too. Do you ever feel like you've lost an important part of yourself? Ask yourself that at this point in the pandemic and everything going on in the world. If so, how long has it been since you last felt yourself? And thinking back, what are things you used to do where you felt alive, vital, and had a sense of inner peace, outer harmony? And can you add any of these things back into your present life? This would be a way that you could re-soul yourself or reanimate yourself. So how would we create a counter curriculum of continuing human education, or a counter curriculum of soul retrieval? You know, it would need to be holistic, a program of holistic wellness. We'd need to think back to what our calling is, what brought us into this work. Think about what it means to be human, you know, not just what it means to be a scientist, but what is the human experience of people moving through our institutions, both ourselves as staff and patients or clients. How can we engage with the medical humanities, with arts and literature, and consuming humanities, as well as creating humanities, engaging with our creativity, spending time in nature, creating our own red book, as Jung did with dreams and journaling and reading and writing and reflecting, reconnecting to ourselves and then reconnecting to others. And, you know, most importantly in our work, how can we cultivate and nourish compassion, self-compassion, and compassion for others? So again, this is kind of an individual thing. I'd love to have a checklist, but I think there's no checklist for the soul. So we'll just have to leave it as that. I'm going to stop sharing, and I won't be able to see y'all, but maybe we can look at question, huh?
Well, first, Dr. Kopat, thank you for walking through this presentation, talking over your personal development motivations into medicine and specifically psychiatry, historical points, and then your main focus here with doing whole health work nationally and not just here. Now, a couple of questions did come in, Dr. Kopat. One, looking for a specific recommendation. Do you recommend, I mean, you've talked a bit about it right at the end, but about dream journaling, dream reflection. I don't know if this question specifically relates to asking patients to do this, but could you comment on that?
Sure. The book I like, this is kind of a Jungian approach, is right here, Inner Work by Robert Johnson. So inner work, using dreams and active imagination for personal growth. So you don't have to get into like a lot of the kind of Jungian theory of it, but it talks about a 4-step approach of first you write out the dream as much as you can remember, first thing in the morning. You make associations. You connect the associations into what's going on in your life, your inner dynamics. Then only at that point would you interpret or think about it, what it means. And then you do a ritual to make the dream concrete. This is what Jung did in the Red Book, of making a painting or a drawing or dance or sculpture, or, you know, however you can try to make the unconscious conscious.
Thank you for your comment on that. I'd like to encourage others to write questions. We have some time to go through any questions or comments. It's interesting to here you've talked about compassion as an evidence-based practice. What does it like to learn what does it look like to learn compassion?
Yeah, there's the rub. You know, it's like, how do you teach somebody to be human? How do you teach somebody to be, you know, a kind person? I think we just assume that's going to happen. Daniel Ofri has written in the New York Times an opinion piece about how institutions take for granted that doctors and nurses and healthcare people are going to be compassionate, but it's burning us out because it's not a measure. You know, we're not measured on whether we're being compassionate, we're measured on all these other things. So one, you know, how can it be taught? And two, even if it's taught, do we have this kind of hidden and not so hidden curriculum that says it's not important, or you're meant to do it? You know, being a professional means we're going to fit another patient in at the end of the day. Whereas if you're a lawyer, you're like, that's great, you know, I'm going to bill you by the minute. But if you're a doctor, you're like, well, you know, I'll always do more because that's what I'm here to do. But then you burn out. So, you know, teaching compassion, I think some of it is just getting in touch with oneself. Like, you know, that vignette that I told, or the story of the veteran crying and not being in touch with himself. He, in a way, he didn't know what he was feeling. And then I had a similar thing where I felt like, I don't know what I'm feeling. So some of the work, you know, that's in self-care, like mindfulness, yoga, Tai Chi, all these different things, part of what they do is they help reconnect everything or reknit all these different human dimensions back together. So one way of looking at compassion is compassion flows when we're interconnected with all these dimensions. But Tibetan Buddhists, for instance, they teach compassion. There's a loving kindness meditation, and the VA actually has a loving kindness. There was a research project going on loving kindness, teaching that to veterans. So I see we've got a nice long comment.
Yeah, here's a comment. I guess I'll get right to the first part of the question, which is, do you think enhanced? I mean, it's part of a larger question, I think, is if you see this as applicable to medicine in general, psychiatry specifically, but this question gets right to what extent do you think enhanced training in psychotherapy can counteract the pressures you describe? And I'll get to other questions within that.
Yeah. So in some ways, I'm counteracting the dominant paradigm. I don't want to subvert the dominant paradigm. So often in mental health and psychology and psychiatry, we go back and forth, and it's nature and nurture, it's the unconscious, or it's the biology. And so, I feel like I'm having to push back a little bit, but I don't want to be seen as being anti-science. I do think psychotherapy could be a way of connecting to ourselves, but it would have to be something that was analogous to Jung's idea of psychotherapy, not just learning how to do CBT and CBT and ACT and these different things, but we'd have to have a psychotherapy that looks at some type of continuing human education. How do we develop the person, the humanity of the therapist? And psychotherapy is a great way to learn that, but it doesn't have to happen in psychotherapy, because there's plenty of people doing this in internal medicine, doing it in even an intensive care unit. There's doctors who preach or practice this kind of humanistic medicine. So I think psychotherapy could be one way of doing it, but there's other ways as well. And whole health at the VA, I think, is a good way. That's not necessarily a mental health intervention, but something we want all specialties and disciplines to be able to think in that way.
Now, I'm sensing that maybe it took a couple of minutes of reflection. Now we're getting a lot of questions here, but I think a follow-up question to that is, it's related from the same individual. If the training in larger, is there a sort of a pressure to be more technician? And maybe that's cultural, maybe it's within a system we work in, maybe it's personal. If there's so many pressures, how does one work against that? Is it really something one can do? Does it take a group practice? Comment on that.
Yeah, so that's why I call it a counter curriculum. It is kind of a pushback against the curriculum. The curriculum's very one-sided. So how do we create a counter curriculum that pushes back, not to get rid of it, but just to have some space? How can we kind of both be here, the human and the scientist, the healer and the technician, to have them have space for both of them. And many of them, these approaches are kind of introverted because our work is so extroverted. With veterans, I often teach them, I don't tell a veteran to sit and meditate and try not to think of anything. I'll give them something active to do. So a more active mental type of meditation, or Tai Chi. I tell them it's an internal martial art. Your opponent is yourself in Tai Chi, but go out and do something physical where you're moving your body instead of trying to just sit with yourself when you've got all this bubbling, trauma and anxiety and fight or flight. It's kind of unrealistic. But
you anticipated the next question, or perhaps you saw that about the suggestions of soul-fulfilling. Yes, thank you for commenting on that right away. Look, Dr. Kopat, I and everyone commenting and writing questions, I think you've identified maybe, if not universal, then perhaps very common motivation for individuals pursuing medicine and clinical care, work in the health sciences related to human connection. It seems people may be reflecting on this. I think you've not only talked about your work, but provided some inspiration. People are asking for next steps. I guess if we would close on that, you've identified several potential sources. Are there groups, organizations working in similar ways, sort of high yield readings you might talk about? And even that term high yield might be more technical.
Right. So Doctors Humanist, great free organization. We do, we're always looking for volunteers and people to attend our symposia. VA Whole Health, it's in the VA, but it's open source. You can just put in your search engine VA Whole Health. There's professional resources, there's patient resources, there's videos, there's downloads, there's all sorts of stuff there. Anyone can access, just not people in the VA. Of course, the books I talked about, this is a book I've read several times during the pandemic, Michael Mead's Awakening the Soul, A Deep Response to a Troubled World. And Mead talks about the soul in kind of this interesting paradoxical way. In a way, he says, when everything's going well, we don't even realize, we don't need to think about the soul because it's right there with us, you know? When we hit some sort of dark, difficult patch, we feel the soul has left us, but it's also the time where the soul has the most to teach us and is trying to come in. So he almost kind of reassures us and says, in the most dark and difficult times is the time when we have the most to learn from the soul, and the soul has the most to give. He's not writing from a religious or spiritual standpoint, more of he's a storyteller or mythological standpoint, you know, kind of a little like a heir of Joseph Campbell in a way. And I'm happy to share my slides with everybody too, with Hess resources.
Thank you. Thank you for offering that. And thank you again, Dr. Kopat, for presenting today at Grand Rounds. And due to time, we'll need to end there. But again, I thank you, and thank you to the participants as well for writing in questions and comments. And we'll end there. Bye.
Thank you.